So last week we started looking at exponents, which we talked about if we had 5 to the third power, we could rewrite that in expanded form as 5 times 5 times 5. So it's whatever the base is times itself this many times. So we can draw blanks based on the number we see in the exponent, and we're filling the blanks with whatever the base is. So that's our base, that's our exponent. And then standard form, we actually multiply those all out. So that was 125. So that was last week with positive numbers, somewhat review from past years. So now this year, to make it 7th grade level work, we're going to add the negatives in here. So now we've got a negative 5 raised to the second. So it's still the same thing. The value being raised to the second is being repeated and being multiplied by itself. So since the exponent's 2, I have 2 blanks here. And what fills the blank is the base. The base here is negative 5. So before I go to standard form, let's jump down. If this is the same thing but raised to the third, I've got 3 blanks. And each blank is being filled with the base. Negative 5, negative 5, negative 5. Now, let's go back up here. Standard form means actually get the answer. Now, we know 5 times 5 is 25, and negative 5 times negative 5 is also positive 25. When you multiply two negatives, you get a positive. We just studied that. So, what happens when I multiply 3 negatives together? Well, the first two, when I put those together, negative 5 times negative 5, that's positive 25, like we just did. But now that number also has to get multiplied by negative 5. This is a positive times a negative. A positive times a negative is a negative answer, and it's 125. So notice, when I raise this negative to the second, I got a positive answer. When I raise this negative to the third, I got a negative answer. So how is that always going to be true? Every time you have groups of 2 negatives, they cancel each other and make a positive. So even if this was to the 4th power, I'd have a negative times a negative, and I'd have 2 more negatives, and they would cancel each other out. So to the 4th power would also be a positive answer. So what we need to recognize is every group of 2, which is what we call our even numbers, so our even exponents, will create a positive answer. And our odd exponents will always create a negative answer, because they're grouping in 2, but there's always that one left over because it's a 3 or it's a 5 or it's a 7. There's groups of 2, 2, 2, and there's that one left over because it's odd. Those will always create your negative. So 2 negatives make a positive, and then when you're left over with 1 extra negative, because these 2 created a positive, now your answer is going to be negative. So let's take a look at the next one. Negative 3 raised to the second. That's negative 3 times negative 3. It's an even exponent. 2 negatives will make a positive. Negative 3 times negative 3 is positive 9. Negative 3 to the third. We should already know that's an odd exponent. It's going to be a negative answer, because this is negative 3 times negative 3 times negative 3. So the first 2 negative 3's make a positive 9. That positive 9 times a negative 3 gives me a negative answer. A positive times a negative. And 9 times 3 is 27. Okay. So now I get down here, and these look a little different. All right, and they are different. So these are going to produce somewhat different answers. So we need to recognize the difference between the two. What's going on? So on these top questions, okay, the negative is inside parentheses, and then the exponent's on the outside, which means everything on the inside of parentheses is being raised to the power. When there's no parentheses here, that means not all of this is being raised to the power, only what it's attached to. So in this case, only the 3 is being raised to the second power. This is a 3 times a 3. This negative is not being raised. This negative is like a negative 1 out front. This is negative 1 times 3 times 3. So the 3 is being raised to the second power. This negative is like a negative 1 sitting out front. So 3 times 3 is 9, times negative 1 is -9. So I want to stop for a second and take a look at this answer and this answer and look at how they started. This -3 raised to the second gave me a positive answer. This -3 to the second gave me a negative answer because it didn't have parentheses. Okay, so this rule up here about even numbers creating positives, odd numbers creating negatives, this whole thing is only true when there's parentheses. If there's no parentheses, okay, then that rule does not hold true. Let's take a look at what happens here. So this negative is not being affected. It's like a -1. The only thing being raised to the second is the 4. So 2 4s, both positives. 4 times 4, 16, times the -1 is -16. So what if it's to the third power? Again, only the 4 is being raised to the third power, so it's +4 3 times. This negative is a -1 out front. So if I multiply 4 times 4 times 4, you can use your calculator. It's 64. Positive 64 times -1 is -64. So we had an even exponent, get a negative. We had an odd exponent, get a negative. If there are no parentheses, it is a negative answer. Okay, because the negative is just going to hang out in front and always create a negative answer. When we've got these parentheses, the negative is being repeated. And sometimes, because it's repeated, it's going to cancel itself out and become positive. Down here, the negative is not being repeated. Only the whole number, which is positive. Okay, so it's going to kind of do some goofy things here. So we've got to be able to see the difference between the two. Let's try a couple together. So if we go down to the bottom, I want you to rewrite these in expanded form and then get me the standard answer. So since this is in parentheses, raised to the second, all of this is raised to the second. Okay, so I need to repeat this entire thing. It's -6 times -6. 2 negatives make a positive, 36. So number 2, it's in parentheses, so the whole thing's being repeated 3 times. -6 times -6 times -6. These 2 negatives will make a positive. That positive times this negative now gives me a negative answer. Now you can use your calculator again to do 6 times 6 times 6. It comes out to 216. Okay, and then there's my answer. Again, it was negative because these two together was a positive 36, and a positive 36 times a -6 equals -216. That's why it's negative. This is positive because 2 negatives made a positive. Number 3 now looks like these. There's no parentheses, so if I'm going to write this in expanded form, the 6 is the only thing being repeated. It's 6 times 6. This negative is like a -1 out front. So the 6 times 6 is 36, and the negative makes it a -36. So we need to see the difference between number 1, which is positive, and number 3, which is negative. Okay, that's huge. Now, let's talk about how this looks in the calculator. Because if you start to rely on your calculator and you just write -6 raised to the second, it's going to give me a -36 answer. But if I look at this, it's positive. So if I'm actually trying to do this problem in my calculator, I have to put the parentheses. Otherwise, it thinks that this looks like number 3. -6 raised to the second, no parentheses. So it's going to give you that answer. So if you never put parentheses in your calculator and you just hit -6 raised to whatever, even if it's to 5, it's going to give you a negative answer. -6 raised to an even number, it's going to give you a negative answer. If you never put parentheses, it's always going to be a negative answer, and your calculator knows that. So you need to be careful. If you're trying to do this question, you need to put an open parentheses, -6, close the parentheses, raised to the second. Now it knows that the -6 is being repeated, and it's positive. So a lot of people get in trouble with that. You're going to try and punch it in your calculator, and you're not going to put the parentheses, and then you're going to get the wrong answer. So you really need to be careful with that. I would suggest just multiplying the 6 in your calculator if you need to, But don't worry about the negatives. You control the negatives. Don't let the calculator do it, because you may put the wrong thing into the calculator. So you got to think. So number 4, we're going to expand this. The whole thing's in parentheses, raised to the second power. So the whole thing needs to repeat. -2 times -2. 2 negatives make a positive, and it's 4. Right? No calculator required for that one. So number 5, it's in parentheses, which means the whole thing repeats 3 times. -2 times -2 times -2. 3 negatives create a negative answer because the first 2 together are +4. +4 times this -2 gives me a -8 answer. Now this -2 raised to the second looks very similar to this -2 raised to the second, but there's no parentheses, which means this negative is just a -1. And this 2 to the second is a +2 to the second power. So I only see one negative in this, so my answer must be negative, and 2 times 2 is 4. So this gives me a positive answer, this gives me a negative answer. All right, let's look at these now with zeros and ones. This gets a little interesting. So anything raised to the first is just itself. So -7 raised to the first is -7. And there's no work to show on that one. It is done. On number 8, we talked about anything raised to the 0 power is just 1. You can try it in your calculator. Anything. 8 raised to 0 is 1. 99 raised to 0, okay, is 1. So -7 raised to 0 is 1. That's the answer. Anything raised to the 0 is 1. But what if you did this in your calculator and you just said -7 raised to the 0? And you go, Mr. Kerr, it says -1. And you just told me it's 1. Well, you didn't put in what I see here. You didn't put in parentheses. Okay, so the calculator thinks you're just raising the 7 to the 0, which is 1, and that negative stays there. In fact, that's what we're looking at on number 9. Okay, this is a -1 times 7 to the 0. 7 to the 0 is 1, but that -1 is still sitting out front, and you're going to multiply it. And so the answer here is -1. So yes, this is to the 0, so you think it must be 1, but that negative is not involved. And so it actually stays and goes to your answer, where here, -7 to the 0 is just 1, because the whole thing is there. So if you're going to do it in your calculator, you have to open the parentheses, -7 raised to the 0. Now you get the positive answer of 1. So the parentheses are very important, even in the calculator. Now, when you do these, you can start to use your calculator. You need to be careful and use parentheses, okay, if you're going to do that. But I still need to see the expanded form. This is -3 times itself 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 times. Okay, but can I do this in my calculator? Yes. So let's try it. Open parentheses, -3 raised to the 5th power, -243. Double check your answer. Does it make sense? We had parentheses and an odd. If you slide up, parentheses and an odd exponent should be a negative answer. So we're good. The next one, we have parentheses and an even. So this should become a positive answer because they're going to group in twos. -3 times -3, those two are going to be positive. Another 2, those will be positive together. And we're trying to get 6 all together, so I need another 2. Those will be positive. So these two together are positive, these two together are positive, these two together are positive. So my final answer here is going to be positive. It's to the 6th, so let's just do 3 raised to the 6th. Notice I didn't even deal with the negatives. I don't have to. I just need the number, 729. And I know the answer is going to be positive. Okay, so I could put it in if I wanted to, use parentheses, -3 raised to the 6th, and get the answer. But I can also figure this out on my own. All right, last one. There's no parentheses, so I know this is going to be a negative answer. And we just did 3 to the 6th. It's 729. Now, if you were going to write this out in expanded form, which I want you to, it's -1, and then just the 3 repeated 6 times. So on your work, I do want to see the expanded form, but then use the calculator to help you get your answer.